My name is Rachel. Welcome. Today is day 4,744 of Boswell being in business, and thank you so much for your continued support. In conversation with former bookseller and friend of the store, Tim Hennessy, editor of Milwaukee Noir and writer in publications such as Midwestern Gothic, Crime Spree Magazine, and the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. We have been lucky enough to see the release of the first two books in this Jane Wunderly series, and it's a favorite of our small marketing crew. And today we're pleased to host the launch of the third in the series, Danger on the Atlantic. Please welcome Milwaukee's Erica Ruth Neubauer.
All right.
Yeah.
Let's do this thing.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I know you have been looking forward to actually having a live event since at least a year before your first book was published.
Yeah.
Because I remember the many different plans you had. So I'm glad we get to.
I'm glad one of us remembers those plans because I surely don't.
So for the people who are new to the series, can you give us a little bit of background on Jane Wunderly?
I can. So Jane Wunderly is a widow. Her husband died in the First World War. She is not upset about it. She was in an abusive marriage. I'll just put it that way. So she and her aunt, in the first book, she and her aunt are traveling to Egypt, and she is accused of a murder and decides to clear her own name. And then in the second book, she and her aunt have traveled to England and get embroiled in a murder, as you do. And then that brings us to this one.
So how would you describe Danger on the Atlantic?
So Danger on the Atlantic is Jane and her love interest, Redvers, are on a transatlantic cruise because it was the golden age of travel in the 20s. It's fabulous. And for the first time, she is being brought in on one of Redvers' assignments. So they are trying to suss out a German spy on board the ship. But in addition to that, as the ship is pulling away from the dock, she sees a man and a woman. And then later, the woman is complaining to the crew that she can't find her husband, and no one believes her. And not only do they not believe her, they don't believe that he was ever there. So the woman is essentially being gaslit. And so Jane is not going to stand for that. So she gets involved in that as well.
So what got you interested in writing a historical mystery series? Is that in the post-World War I era?
So I was raised on old black and white movies and Agatha Christie and masterpiece mystery. And somewhere along the way, I picked up very romantic ideas about the 1920s, especially in Egypt. I have very clear idea in my head of elegantly dressed people in a fancy hotel in Egypt, with slow turning fans overhead and then a dead body in the corner. And so when I sat down to write a book, I also love to read historical mysteries. That must be said. So when I sat down to write a book, I was like, well, of course I'm going to set it in 1920s Egypt, clearly. And it's also an homage to all of the Agatha Christie that I read as a young woman.
When you have a project that you're working on, how do you get started?
I get started like any good book nerd, and I get a lot of books about the subject. So each of my books goes to a different location, which I just made a lot of extra work for myself. But I love the researching. And I love falling down rabbit holes. So usually what I do is I find a bunch of books about the subject, the time period, and read those. And usually it'll spark things for me, like, secondary characters, their backstories, or, whatever social issues were going on at the time in that area. And then I like to draw those in.
And I think in all the time you've talked about this, I've never asked about how you go through, like how you prepare to write about a new location. I mean, travel in general is stressful enough. And
I like it.
Yeah, I guess I don't travel as much. I have to. But I can only imagine what preparation stuff. Do you have certain stuff that you've planned out that you want to definitely visit? Do you kind of have more of a go with the flow and see what, I would imagine for a writer, and going to a new place. It's a blank slate, possibly, or maybe one that you really kind of could have an itinerary for where you saw the book going. I mean, how do you choose? I mean, to me, when I travel, it's just like an overload of different new experiences. And if you're trying to focus and, take notes and whatever process you may have, I'm curious to hear more about how you approach it.
So for the first book, I definitely wrote the entire book. I think it was almost finished before I went to Egypt. So I did all of the research up front. And then while I was in Egypt, I had a whole list of questions actually that our guide, who's a lovely man named Waleed, he sat and answered all of my questions about Egypt in the 1920s. But I also then had a list of things that I wanted to see to double check. I had to check my work. And by the time when I got back, there were only, I think, 2 things that I needed to change. And one of them was going into the pyramid was much different than I had written it. But the rest of it, I had done my research well, and it was correct. The second book, I had been to England numerous times, so I didn't actually travel there for that book. And then the third one, same thing. I had written most of the book. I did a lot of research on the ship before going there. And then while I was on board the ship, did revisions. I find it that I don't necessarily know what I don't know until I've written the book. So once I've written the book, then I kind of have an idea of what do I need to see? What do I need to figure out when I'm there? And then I can make a list and an itinerary.
So can you give us an example of what might be a detail that you found through a travel experience that was kind of a revelation that you knew that you had to include in the book, whether it's, big or small?
I think, the pyramids. Honestly, is that I just got back from Istanbul for research for book 4, and that city is really hilly. I did not know that, and I don't think I would have come up with that in my research. But not quite like San Francisco, but almost. Some of the hills are quite steep. I was like, oh, this is way different than I had anticipated it being.
So when writing a historical mystery, did it get easier to know what type of details you needed to kind of balance out both, plot and just the details and, fleshing out sort of the more sensory details so that it wouldn't bog down your narrative?
I hope I'm doing that well. I think that was easier for me just because like I said, I read so many of them, and I kind of have an idea of the ones that I like. I know what kind of mix I like between the detail and then the plot.
So when you're writing with historical with a perspective, how do you balance the modern perspective on a historical point of view, a historical time?
Right. So one of the reasons I really liked the 1920s is that for women, they were pushing against the strictures that had been in place for them for so many years. They, they were starting to get jobs outside of the home. They were starting to go out dancing and wear their skirts short and smoke and drink and have sex and do all the things. And there was definitely that changed again after World War II, and we kind of went backwards. But I really liked that they were pushing towards a more modern sensibility. And I will say I definitely probably push as far as I think I can get away with in these books to having a modern sensibility for her. But it's one of the reasons I like the 20s so much.
Yeah, that's sort of the great part with Jane. She seems like somebody who does a good job of balancing a perspective that it's relatable now, as well as somebody who feels like they are appropriately living in a time where it is not at all like now.
No, I would not have done well. So
she does, Jane, very much seem like she's ahead of her time. Do you think somebody with a progressive mindset like her was common then, or was just maybe not as representative?
You said you weren't going to ask me any hard questions, Tim Hennessy.
I stayed up late thinking about them. So,
You know, I don't know the answer to that. I want to believe that there were, I mean, you had the suffragists, and I want to believe that there were people with progressive sensibilities, but I think like even now we're still moving forward and there's always some backwards motion.
What were some of the challenges you had weaving two mysteries that were going to converge at one point and such a limited location as a boat?
Well, he's very familiar with this because he put up with a summer's worth of walking at the park with his son while I hashed out the plot of this book. It was hard. And I think both you and my freelance editor that I work with gave me some good advice on how to better balance those storylines and how to make the one storyline stronger than it had been initially. So thank you for that. Good job.
I enjoyed the fact that even though I did help with that, there were twists that I did not either remember, which is certainly possible, or did not see coming. So I was like, oh, okay.
Killing it.
Either my memory is exceedingly poor or you really had me going the other way. So that was certainly fun. How do you have the series mapped out, and is there a trajectory for where you see Jane going?
So I have a contract for 3 more books. Thank you. So book 4 is Istanbul. I believe book 5 is going to be set on a remote Scottish island, and there is going to be some occult stuff. And then I got one enthusiast here for that. And book 6, I'm not sure yet. There's also a Christmas novella that will come out after book 4 that I just turned in today. Right? Christmas novella.
So how does the routine of writing work into your day?
So even though I am not a morning person, it is the first thing that I have to do. It's for whatever reason, my brain is the freshest, I guess. So usually I get up in the morning, I have my breakfast, and then I go to my coffee shop and I work for several hours. And Jane drinks a lot of coffee because I drink a lot of coffee, just a lot of coffee. And so I probably work for, I don't know, I try to work for like 4 hours a day in the mornings, and then let my brain have a rest in the afternoons.
And reading is a big part of Jane's life. With your schedule, do you still find time to read as much as you'd like?
The short answer is no. I will say that since the pandemic, I have really struggled to read as much as I normally like to. And I'm starting to pick back up again. But I mean, for a while, I was reading 150 books a year, and I fell way short of that during the pandemic. I probably only had 50 books last year.
That's still a lot compared to most people.
I mean, fair. So yeah, I think I'm at 22 for this year so far.
Is there anything you're reading right now that you're really into?
Oh man.
We can save that one.
Why don't you save that and I can think about it quietly for a minute?
So one of the things about your background that's always been really interesting to me is you've been in the military, you were a police officer, you have a private eyes license, you taught. So why did you choose writing? Like, what about writing has always appealed to you?
To be honest, I always wanted to be a writer. Even when I was a little kid, that's what I wanted to do. A friend of mine messaged me, and I had completely forgotten about this, but she said, remember when we went to the local Palmyra library and we tried to look up haunted houses in town so we could write a story about it? And I was like, I do not remember that, but it does sound like something that I would do. I think I've always wanted to be a writer. It just took me a long time to actually go after it because it is a scary thing to put a piece of work out into the world.
And do you think like the previous jobs you had, was it as much just misdirection or just figuring out what you weren't before you could figure out what you were?
I think that is 100% it. And I'm going to use that from now on.
Sounds good.
That's it. Thanks.
All right. Well, that's all I've got.
All right. Who's got questions? Oh, she wants to know what my favorite Agatha Christie novel is. That is a tough question. Man, you guys coming with the tough questions. There are so many good ones. I think for me, it is Death on the Nile. And I know that's kind of cliche, but I really love that. Yeah. Yes.
That is why the first book is set in Egypt. I'm just repeating the question.
Thank you. You're doing a great job.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, I really loved that. Really loved that setting. And I really did pick up romantic ideas about it from watching all those movies and shows growing up. One of which for sure was, the old Peter Ustinov, Agatha Christie, not our movies, which I really enjoy. So yeah, but I didn't think I could do Egypt the same service that someone say like Elizabeth Peters has done. She has the series set in Egypt in kind of the same time period. Amelia Peabody, but she did such a fantastic job that I knew I couldn't keep the series there. And also this moving them from place to place gives me an excuse to travel.
So the question was, are you planning at... I'm giving you a second to think that one.
I really appreciate it. Let's draw this out.
So are you planning out the trajectory of Jane's life, or figuring out just the next book based on where you like travel next? I'm paraphrasing.
Thank you. I had a definite trajectory for her for the first 3 books. Which is impressive because I'm an absolute pantser. For anyone who doesn't know what that is, it means I write by the seat of my pants. I have no idea what's happening in that book until it happens. And then I'm like, oh, cool. So I didn't even know who the murderer was until like 2/3 of the way through the first book. And I was like, did this person do it? I think they did. They did. So I will have a trajectory. I think we're going to learn more about both her and Redvers in the second trilogy.
Speaking of Death of the Nile, who would you like to have play in your characters on the big screen?
This is hard because I don't know a lot of modern actors. Like I could easily pick, it would be like Rock Hudson and, like it would be so easy. Although I did watch the new Murder on the Orient Express the other night, and I thought, you know what, Daisy Ridley did a good job. I could see her. For others, I have no idea. Rock Hudson really is.
Given your inability to hold a straight job.
Sounds better in a microphone too.
Oh yeah, no, it is. How has your military experience, your experience working as a cop, what has that brought to your fiction?
Yeah.
And teaching?
I will say it has given me a lot of exposure to different people, which I think is great for developing characters and pulling quirks and maybe stealing some things for secondary characters. I will definitely say I think that both the military and being a cop have given me discipline, because when I'm writing. So I will go every day and sit in that coffee shop. I don't take weekends unless something is happening where I give myself a day off. Like I'm very disciplined about it. So I will go and do my job. And I think even though I can't keep a straight job, I think that has definitely been a takeaway for me.
I would also add, having helped you with the private investigation, I would say, I think learning how to ineptly follow somebody in a speeding vehicle. So,
yeah, he's right. We were not great at that.
No, harder to do than it looks. So I guess we've got an experience to stake out.
So I was fortunate that I was in the mystery community and in the industry for a long time before I started to write. I was a reviewer for many years before I sat down and wrote my first novel. So I knew that, especially in the mystery world, they want a book a year. So that is what I set for myself as a guideline. So the first book I wrote the first draft in 6 weeks, which is ridiculous, and I've never done since. But then I did all the revisions and completed it within a year, and all of them since then. I would say it takes me 2 to 3 months to do a first draft. Then I set it aside, and then I come back and work on it for probably another 2 to 3 months doing revisions.
So a big fan of your books wants to know, how did you research steamships? And
So I got a lot of books about it. Legitimately, I got a lot of books about it. And I set it on the Olympic, which is the sister ship to the Titanic, because it was easy to get so much good information and actual pictures of both the first and the second class quarters and all of the rooms on board. There's just a wealth of information out there. So I was able to easily, so that's all real. All those things are real. I'm not tricking you. I mean, about other things, but not about that. They are all the different murders.
so where do you get the inspirations for the different mysteries?
So that's a good question.
It is.
So I don't know about the first book. I don't remember. The second book, the inspiration was that I wanted to talk about veterans of the First World War. And so I had to kill one of them, and then things ensued. And then this one, I actually was inspired by a really old movie called Dangerous Crossing. It's a lot of great face acting in it, where the woman is being gaslit. And I was like, oh, that's great. And also the spy sequence is because I Googled what is happening in 1926 and came across this piece about Robert Goddard, who was a real physicist and was doing testing of liquid propelled rockets. And he later claimed that the Germans came and stole that technology for him and used it in World War II. And I was like, what if someone was trying to come over here and steal that technology? And so that's where that storyline came from. And for book 4, I was watching Destination Truth, I think. And there was an episode about the Sultan's heart. It's a real artifact. The Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent was a great ruler of the Ottoman Empire, and he died on the battlefield in Hungary in like the 1400s. I'm not good with dates. And his heart and his other internal organs were buried on the battlefield and never recovered. And it's a real thing. And so book 4, that is what her father and then Jane and Redvers are seeking. So I like to pull an actual historical thing and then use it.
Other than Jane, who's your other favorite character to write?
I really like to write Aunt Millie because she's such a pain. And she is based on my grandmother, Lois. Grandma Lois liked to stir the pot like a lot. That lady also really loved her jug wine. And so I gave Millie an upgrade with the whiskey. I have. Thank you for asking.
The question was have you taken personal revenge, and how frequently?
I had a boss in the military that I disliked very strongly. And her name was Anne. And if anyone remembers, the person who dies in the first book, her name is Anna. It's weird.
So the question was, do you start with a murder storyline that you're developing and trying to build around, or do you have a storyline in general that you're trying to incorporate the murder into?
That's a really good question. I think it might be a little bit of both.
Do you think often in terms of like A plot, B plot of like?
No, Tim, I don't. I'm a pantser. Like, I don't know what I'm doing. I just sit down and just start like stuff starts happening. The A plot, B plot is for revisions. But yeah, I think a little bit of both. I mean, I'll speak to it still. So Carrie was just speaking about Jane's dark backstory. And I will say that I did that very deliberately. I tried to kind of highlight subtly an issue in each book, but that one is an overarching, a really big issue for me because I feel very strongly about domestic violence. When I was a police officer, I went on a lot of domestic violence calls, and they're very dangerous calls for the people involved and for police officers. And it's scary and frustrating because you feel like you're just putting a Band-Aid on a situation and then walking away. And I think it obviously wasn't spoken about then, and it's still not spoken about enough now, which is why I gave her that backstory, just to shine a little tiny light on it. Yeah, so the question was about the editing process. So I work with a freelance editor first, which is completely optional. Some authors do it, not everyone does. I started out with her before I even sent out my book for querying to agents or to anyone. And we just work really well together. So I continue to work with her and pay her out of my own pocket. So I work with her before I send it to my editor at the publishing house. Now, if I didn't send it to her, I would just send it to my editor at the publishing house, and he would do the edits and then send them back to me and say, this is what I need you to fix. Typically how it works is that your agent will sell your book to an editor. So the editor is going to be the one who picks your book to work with it. They're the one that likes your book enough that they want to, work with you. So you're not really assigned them, but they do choose you.
So when you were shopping your first book, was it something that you had people who were eager for it right away, or something that took a little bit longer of a process to find a home for it?
I actually think I was really fortunate. It took me several months to find an agent. I would say 6, and I had about 40 rejections, which is not many. I have a friend who had 400 rejections before she found her agent. So it's a lot of persistence. And I think by the time I signed with my agent, Ann Collette, I think she sold it 3 or 4 months later. It was very quick for me. And I know that's not the case for a lot of people. I was very, very fortunate.
So I do have a question. So working with a freelance editor and then working with the publisher's editor, what has that relationship been like with having different people look at your manuscript at different stages, and how have kind of blending different pieces of advice or different notes, has it been different for each book, or has it been kind of what has it been like? So
the first book, I had notes from my freelance editor, Zoe Quinton, and then I had notes from my agent, which weren't many. And then I had some notes from the editor at the publishing house, which again, weren't many. I actually was able to do them in like a couple of hours, which I think was kind of unusual. And since then, because I continue to work with Zoe, my last 2 books, my editor at the publishing house has had no changes for me, which is why I definitely continue to work with Zoe. So I'm turning in a clean manuscript that he wants no changes. I found her because I have been attending conferences for so long, mystery conferences, and she's actually just a really good friend of mine who started her own freelance editing business. So we kind of went into it together. She was starting out and I was starting out. She still takes fiction, but if you ask around, like, people will give you recommendations for good editors that are out there.
Are there any locations that you would like to write about that you have earmarked for the future?
I wouldn't say a location. I have the characters from book 1. I really liked Charlie and Deanna, the vaudeville actors. I'd actually like to bring them back and then pick a really cool city somewhere in the US. So I think I would like to do that. Other than that, there's so many amazing places to go. Like Morocco would be great. Anyway, really the British have had enough influence that I could justify sending them there.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming tonight.
Thank you.